Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Farmside, the show where we go into the science and education behind farming. I'm Emily Stein, and today we're continuing the conversation in IPM in different disciplines. Today we're talking to Nevin about integrated weed management and how it relates to integrated pest management. Nevin, can you describe the difference between integrated pest management and integrated weed management?
Integrated pest management was something that was invented or conceived of first by entomologists, and the idea in IPM for weeds, or integrated weed management as you might call it, is basically trying to use a multitude of approaches to reduce herbicide use. And so is there a way we can integrate different weed control strategies, such as cultural, mechanical, and biological control, in order to reduce the amount of herbicides that we're applying? And the thought on that is that reducing herbicide use may reduce costs for farmers. It reduces exposure of herbicides to the applicator, which sometimes those can be toxic or carry some sort of health risks. There's environmental benefits too. Some herbicides can leach into groundwater or can cause off-target injury to weeds or to plants, desirable plants, if applied improperly. And all these things together is a good reason why we should try to reduce herbicide use if we can. But there's also a lot of benefits of herbicides as well, including generally they're going to be easier to integrate into a system. So if we're going to be looking to incorporate tillage or cover crop, that might require farming a different way by buying a new piece of equipment or adjusting some of your ongoing practices. And so it's a bit easier to integrate herbicides into the system. It's also could be costly to add new approaches other than just using different herbicide practices. So it's a trade-off, and everything in agriculture is a trade-off. But basically, that's what integrated weed management is in a nutshell, is trying to use diverse management approaches in order to reduce the usage or need of different herbicides.
You've previously mentioned something you call the critical period when it comes to weed management. Can you expand on that concept?
Yeah, so this is sort of something that I think kind of is the closest thing we have to what would be considered an economic threshold or an economic injury level in entomology when they talk about IPM. So in entomology, what they're trying to do is figure out at what population threshold a certain insect pest is going to cause enough injury that it's going to be justified to use an insecticide. And if your insect population never gets above that threshold, there would be no reason to apply that insecticide. And so a lot of entomology or a lot of IPM practices based on entomology are formed on the idea of, you're going to be scouting for the pests, you're going to be tracking those pests throughout the season, you're going to know what these thresholds are, and they do a lot of research to establish these thresholds and sort of guide these thresholds. And those strategies in a lot of ways just don't work for weed science. And so you can't really scout for a weed. So it's in the soil, the seed's in the soil, and it's going to come up that next year. There are ways to sample the soil, extract that seed, figure out what that seed is, but those are really difficult to do in a timely fashion, and they're almost always going to be uneconomical. So it's very difficult to scout for weeds in an agronomic setting. And as far as thresholds go, there is always going to be enough weeds present in the soil to cause economic injury all the time. There's never going to be a situation that, I wouldn't say never. I've heard of stories of high-value vegetable producers putting something like a soil sterilant on the ground, like that kills everything. But that's very expensive and not very practical. But there's rarely going to be instances where there's so few weeds that there won't have an economic injury. So you can't really scout, and you just should expect that every year there's enough weeds to cause economic injury. So then, how do we sort of model or determine when and when not to control weeds? And so this idea was proposed, called a critical period of weed control, which is where you do a series of experiments where in sort of half the study, you control weeds maybe for the first week, and then the second week, and the third week, and the fourth week of the field season. So you're going to let the plots be weed-free for a certain number of weeks, and then you stop controlling the weeds. So you might have a treatment where you have a 1 week weed-free period, and a 2 week, and a 3 week, and a 4 week. And so the longer those weed-free periods are, the less yield you're going to lose. And that's pretty easy to understand. On the other end of that experiment, what you do is you let the weeds be there all season long, and then later on in the season, you start controlling those weeds. And so you're going to start controlling the weeds, let's say, 4 weeks after they've been established all season, and then 5 weeks, then 6 weeks. And so on the front end, you have different weed-free periods, and then on the back end, you have different periods of weed control. And when you take those two values together, you can model then, okay, to preserve, let's say, 95% or 98% of the yield potential of this crop, we need to control weeds from 2 weeks from planting until 4 weeks to harvest. And early on in the year, we can let weeds grow, and then late on in the season, we can let weeds grow as well. And that's going to prevent any economic yield loss. And so that's kind of the best we can do in weed science as far as modeling when and when not to control weeds. And so the threshold really doesn't have to do with the population of the weeds. The threshold has to do with the stage of crop production, where certain stages of crop production may be more susceptible to yield loss.
So in your mind, should integrated weed management be focused on preserving yield or eliminating weeds?
That's a good question. And one of the problems with the critical period of weed control is it's focused on preserving yield. So that's an economic benefit. But you're producing all of those weed seeds. And so those weeds that you decide we can let grow for these periods, especially on the tail end, are going to produce seeds. And so you're contributing more weed seed to the soil, which might create more problems in the future. And it also sort of ignores all the other problems with weeds. And so we have direct costs of weeds, which is generally competition and yield loss, but there's also indirect costs of weeds. So we have potential for weeds to contaminate weed seeds, to contaminate the grain that we're harvesting, or lower quality, and those may not be factored into this equation. So we might say that if you let weeds grow at the end of the season, you're not going to have that much yield loss, but you also might be sucking in a bunch of Palmer amaranth seed, let's say, into your combine, which is then going to create some problems. Weeds can also be hosts for insects or pathogens, and so that model also doesn't really take into account those issues. And so although the critical period of weed control is a way we can model when and when not to control weeds, in a lot of ways it's a bit too simplistic. Additionally, this idea of waiting until 2 or 3 weeks into the season to control weeds, while that may work, it ignores how a lot of our herbicides are used. And generally in weed science, the best time to apply herbicides are going to be before the weeds ever germinate, or at least before they emerge from the soil. And so we can put on soil active herbicides early in the year, which prevent weeds from emerging from the soil. And it's easier generally to control a weed before they emerge. They're going to have less yield impact because they never actually come out of the soil. And these models sort of ignore that. And so for a large part, this critical period idea ignores some of these issues, and it is a bit simplistic for what farmers actually need to do.
So then how does integrated weed management differ from resistance management?
So one of the problems with integrated weed management is that the idea is you're trying to reduce pesticide use or herbicide use. And so, okay, if you throw in a cover crop and you do this sort of tillage strategy, and maybe you plant your crop a little earlier, a little later, or at a higher density, you can reduce your reliance on herbicides. And what that generally means is that you're going to be using less herbicides, and not less herbicide, but less number of herbicides. So a farmer might be using, in let's say a cornfield, 4 to 5 active ingredients sometimes, so different types of chemicals to control weeds. And so what this integrated weed management does, usually if it's successful at reducing herbicide use, what that means is you're going to reduce it now down to 2 or 1 herbicide. And a big one that would be reduced, especially since, the herbicide that would be then the herbicide of choice, especially after the introduction of herbicide-resistant crops through transgenic technologies or gene insertion, would be glyphosate. So what you're doing now is you're reducing the need for these other herbicides, and you can just get by with one herbicide, let's say, or two herbicides. In large part, that'd be glyphosate. So what that does then is it puts a tremendous amount of selection pressure on the weeds to evolve resistance to glyphosate. And so sometimes what integrated weed management does is it makes it reduces your number of herbicides you're using, so that one herbicide or the two herbicides that are left are more likely then to get resistance development. And that's a problem. And so in the long term, thinking about all these different strategies, is the goal to reduce herbicide practices, or is the goal to preserve all these different tools? So as soon as we have resistance developed to a certain herbicide, that herbicide might not be able to be used then in that field for a very long time and potentially forever because of that resistance development. And so integrated weed management also seems to neglect that as well. And so resistance management, which is a different idea, is you use as whatever tools are available to spread out that selection pressure, so it's not just focused on a single herbicide, or it's going to be focused on several herbicides. So the idea of herbicide resistant management is you are going to use cover crops, you are going to use tillage where appropriate, you are going to use cultural practices, but that's in addition to applying as many herbicides that are useful, and trying not to rely on a single chemical or a few chemicals year after year after year. That way you're spreading off the selection pressure. And the idea is basically just diversity. The more diverse your management practices are, the harder it is for a particular weed species to adapt to that and become very difficult to manage year after year after year.
Do you think integrated weed management is sustainable?
So that really depends on what you mean by sustainable, and that's a tricky term. I like to think of sustainable meaning, is this practice going to be something that farmers can keep doing for 30 years? Can they keep using that? And one of the problems, as I said, with integrated weed management is you tend to narrow the number of herbicides you use, and that's going to place a big burden on those weeds to become resistant to that. So in some points, I would say it's probably not the best strategy. Using herbicide resistance management, where you are using a diversity of the herbicides along with multiple approaches to really broaden that selection pressure, probably is the best management practice for some folks. Although it's very complicated to implement that, because it's very complex. So how do we take a very diverse herbicide management program, which may be costly because you're using multiple herbicides, multiple cultural approaches, and then you have to fit that in with other practices, your fertility, your disease, insect management, and it gets to be actually quite complicated. But in some ways, I feel like integrated weed management, or IPM for weeds, this idea of just narrowing down the use of herbicides over time may not be the best strategy.
Well, folks, there you have it. Today we talked to Dr. Nevin Lawrence about integrated weed management and how it differs from integrated pest management within weed science. Join us next time as we talk to Bob about how integrated pest management relates to plant pathology, and we continue our exploration into integrated pest management. Find us on Twitter @TheFarmSide, or visit our website at farmsci-ed.com for transcripts and other episodes. Have a good one!